Welcome back to our channel, where we talk about interesting and sometimes sad stories from the past. Today we're looking into a sad but important topic. What happened to the bodies of the people who were affected by the Chernobyl disaster? But before we start, let's think about how big accidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima can be. They are reminders that even though nuclear energy can be safe, accidents can have serious consequences for people. Chernobyl was a really bad accident, and it's still affecting us today. It hurt a lot of people, especially the firefighters who were heroes in trying to stop it. The first two victims. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster claimed the life of engineer Valery Kodemchuk before anyone else. Kodemchuk and his co-worker Volodymyr Sheshenok were on site working at the time of the initial explosion and running some tests. Kodemchuk went to reactor number 4's engine room to check the test results, and that's when the reactor blew a monstrous fireball of nuclear material into the atmosphere. Kodemchuk's remains have never been recovered. For safety purposes, Soviet engineers built a massive concrete and steel shell around reactor number 4, one that cannot be. Sheshenok tried to rescue Kodemchuk, but couldn't. First responders found him on site, severely irradiated and burned from steam and water. "It was not my husband at all. It was a swollen blister," Sheshenok's wife, Lyudmila Sheshenok, said when she arrived at the hospital. For his part, Sheshenok kept muttering, "I turned off the voltage. I did everything." He died 5 hours after being recovered. Sheshenok was buried 2 days later in a regular cemetery near Chernobyl. Lyudmila didn't attend because everyone in the area had been evacuated and no one told her the time of the funeral. A year later, his body was disinterred and moved to Mitinskoye Cemetery, where he was placed in a lead coffin and covered in concrete to protect the environment from his irradiated body. Flames from the initial Chernobyl explosion climbed to more than 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit, and firefighters on the scene were exposed to lethal doses of radiation. Lieutenant Volodymyr Pripyat and his squad of 13 firefighters were amongst those exposed to the worst of it. Radiation levels directly inside reactor number 4 were so high that it would have taken a mere 48 seconds of exposure to seal someone's fate, per coffee or die. Pripyat and a team of 5 individuals, Vladimir Tishura, Nikolai Titanov, Vasily Ignatenko, Nikolai Vashchuk, and Viktor Kibenko, took to the roof to pour water down on the reactor. From there, they lasted an hour before their muscles began to fail them, and they started retching, and they themselves wound up having to be rescued. These men were only 6 of 29 firefighters who died in the performance of their job and duty. More and more firefighters kept showing up at Chernobyl, not really equipped for radiation exposure, but charged in any way to douse the flame. The Guardian reported that Pripyat's brown eyes turned blue from such intense radiation exposure, while the autopsy of fellow firefighter Nikolai showed that he had developed blisters on his heart. Even their gear was so radioactive that it was dumped in the basement of Pripyat Hospital and can't be approached without a hazmat suit and filter-breathing apparatus. Like engineer Vladimir Sheshenok, these firefighters had to be buried in lead coffins to keep the environment safe. They were interred at Mitinskoye Cemetery along with Sheshenok. As the Journal of Radiation Research on the National Library of Medicine shows, the explosion at Chernobyl radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere, like xenon-133, strontium-90, iodine-131, and many more. While each isotope has its own half-life, how long it takes to decay? Some take longer to decay than others. The real problem, as a report from the Council of Europe explains, is that each isotope breaks down into other isotopes, which then break down into other isotopes, and so forth. The whole process can take hundreds, if not thousands of years. Chernobyl vented such particles into the air for 10 days straight. But regardless of how many isotopes Chernobyl released into the atmosphere or how heavy the exposure to certain individuals, radioactive material doesn't stay lodged in the body for the entire duration of an isotope's half-life. Most radiation enters and leaves the body within a day, while some particles can linger up to a few weeks. Why then were engineer Vladimir Shashanok and Chernobyl's first responders buried in lead caskets and sealed in concrete? Lead is the leading material used to block radiation, and concrete, especially dense concrete, is excellent at blocking radiation too. Famed Nobel Prize-winning scientist Marie Curie was buried in a lead casket because she had been exposed to so much radiation over her life. But that was back in the 1930s. Ultimately, even though isotopes don't stay in the body, it's just a sound precautionary measure to bury exposed individuals in the lead casket. As we mentioned, the first responders to the Chernobyl disaster were buried at Pitinskoye Cemetery in northwestern Moscow in a designated area of the cemetery. Each firefighter has his own memorial, although it's unclear whether or not the memorials sit on top of the firefighters' actual graves. Behind the memorials, as though presiding over the scene, stands a large statue of a man with his arms outstretched in front of a mushroom cloud. By all accounts, Pitinskoye Cemetery is a well-known cemetery for all manner of prominent Soviet and Russian individuals, including artists, athletes, scientists, and victims of other tragedies like 2004's Beslan school hostage crisis. On that note, find a grave list some individuals buried at the cemetery who were associated with Chernobyl but not amongst those who died in its 1986 disaster. Amongst them rests Valery Legasov, a Soviet chemist who committed suicide 2 years after the Chernobyl reactor, for reasons such as sense of guilt for not having pushed back harder against Chernobyl's faulty design. In this way, we could say that individuals like Legasov count as further victims of Chernobyl. While Pitinskoye Cemetery isn't exactly the easiest place to reach nowadays, it can still be visited by those seeking to learn about Chernobyl or just pay their respects. The cemetery is open 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. May to September and 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. October to April. The final victims of Chernobyl haven't been laid to rest yet, at least as far as we know. The Journal of Clinical Oncology, via the National Library of Medicine, talks about the well-documented connection between radiation exposure from Chernobyl and thyroid cancer. Despite evacuation efforts in 1986, thousands of people were still exposed to high levels of radiation. Those who were exposed at a young age showed the greatest risk of developing not only thyroid cancer but leukemia, blood disease, cardiovascular disease, and cataracts. This is also what happened to those individuals involved in Chernobyl's cleanup efforts. The US Nuclear Regulatory Commission says 600,000 people were involved in cleaning up Chernobyl, with 200,000 people working from 1986 to 1987. About 106 workers got sick from radiation and many developed cataracts. By 2005, 6,000 people had thyroid cancer from the radiation. Sadly, from 1987 to 2006, 19 of the sick workers passed away, but we don't know where they were buried. We also don't know about the survival rate of those with thyroid cancer. It's likely that Chernobyl has more victims than we realize, and there may be more in the future. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content. Let's honor the memories of those affected by never forgetting their stories.